I finally watched the Buccaneers season 2 on Apple Plus, so let's talk about it. Now, going into season 2 of the show that is based on the last unfinished Edith Wharton novel, I had reservations. And honestly, I was going into season 2 not really expecting to like it. And yet, I found myself enjoying season 2, I think, more than season 1. But before we jump all the way into the why of that, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things, including book to screen adaptations on this channel. And if any of that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little bit longer. Now, we left off season 1 of The Buccaneers at Nan and Theo's wedding as Nan was preparing to walk down the aisle and give her life to a man she did not love in order to save her sister. And while in the book, we kind of are suddenly thrust 2 years into Nan's marriage and her unhappy marriage with the equivalent of Theo, because the characters are much, much different from book to screen, especially in that instance. In the show, we return and are dropped right back where we started, which is kind of ironic in a way, because in the book, we are jumping ahead 2 years, and in the show, we have gone through 2 years and are going right back to where we left off. And with that, we return to kind of the central question that we left off on, and one of the main deviations in the first part of the show, or season 1 of the show, from the book in relation to Nan's parentage and the fact that she was not a legitimate daughter of Mrs. St. George, and the return of her biological mother. With this as well, while I can't promise to touch on every moment and aspect of this season, there will absolutely be spoilers in this discussion. So we return, and I will admit to still having some lingering fears and reservations that Miss Test Valley would end up being the reveal of Nan's mother, primarily because she really is the motherly figure in the book, and we have really seen her written out of the show pretty much completely. She does have some appearances in season 1, and she is behind getting the girls debuted, essentially. However, she is not really present, especially to the breadth and depth of the book, which we will get back to here in a second. So we have the big reveal of Nan's mother and the fact that it is in fact Mrs. St. George's sister, and that sister is being played by Leighton Meester. And plotting of this aside, though this sets up a lot of parallel plots for the rest of the season, I actually think this moment is genius, because I think it's a lot more intertextual and referential than it gets credit for, and is almost a kind of passing of the torch in some ways. Because while The Buccaneers is, of course, based on the Edith Wharton novel, this particular version of the show and the story and the way it's being envisioned and given to us is very, very Gossip Girl, especially this season. And so it feels like a passing of the torch in some ways, but also a callback and a return to form in a lot of ways. Because, and I have mentioned this before, though I have not done the dedicated kind of deep read to really dive fully into this, but Gossip Girl itself, the novels, original 2000s novels, as much as the show, and I will admit that I've only read the first Gossip Girl book because I read them, or it, when it came out, and I will admit to not liking that first book. However, the parallels and the inspiration Gossip Girl took from Edith Wharton in particular is unquestionable, especially if we're looking at the kind of return of Serena that starts off both the show and the books, and how that parallels to something like Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, the fact that we are kind of using the modernization of the gossip column with the gossip blogs within Gossip Girl, and the use of names in Gossip Girl that I believe are directly referential to Edith Wharton. And so I do think that this bit of casting was particularly inspired, and it ties a lot of that together in a kind of meta way. But this moment also really establishes and sets off the chain of major, major differences in season 2 in comparison with the book, while still in a lot of ways being kind of referential or having echoes of plotting from the book. And again, I'm interested in how they're in conversation and what is successful about taking more ownership of certain plot lines and what may not be working in whatever way. But I do think it is unquestionable that the creative decisions of this show are being made in a very distinct way and has a very distinct voice. And I talked about, when talking about season 1 to whatever depth, coming across a quote from the creators and showrunners in relation to not considering the Mainwaring completion of the novel, which was done based on Edith Wharton's notes and is considered, I believe, to my kind of knowledge of Wharton and the landscape and my kind of perusals of JSTOR, as kind of the definitive finished version of the book. You can, of course, have debate about whether it is canon or what stands. Absolutely. And this production in particular has made it clear that they do not consider the completion by Mainwaring canon or textual. That being said, they are deviating from canon. And of course, canon is a much more modern term for the kind of concept of this. However, I think that I misread it or potentially misinterpreted the instinct of that in my original kind of read and interpretation of it, because I really kind of viewed it as them being purists of the text in some way and kind of wanting to stick close to the Wharton and not considering Mainwaring definitive or official. But I do not think that that is the instinct or the reason for that decision, especially in context of season 2 and also revisiting that quote or a different version of that quote, because I don't remember which one I absolutely kind of encountered first. But this version of it talked about that or mentioned that, but then also talked about wanting the central love story and the central story of this to be about the girls and the young women. And we see this really centered and solidified. There's even a quote later in the season, and paraphrase that quote was along the lines of, "It should have been us. Like, the love story should have been us." Again, not direct quote, but I believe dialogue-wise much better than the "we always come first" of season 1, which I still think was just a little too on the nose, a little too ham-fisted right at the beginning of the season. And I do believe the dialogue here, while still a little bit stylistic, a little bit campy almost in some ways, was much better than season 1, and we will get to some of the differences between season 1 and season 2 story-wise that I think helps with that. But with the girls being the central story, and I think that that was very evident with the way that this season was shaped and the kind of complications of it, the deliciousness of it that again kind of harkens back to Gossip Girl and its kind of messiness. Additionally, in light of the way that we left off the season, I think that we are talking about not being beholden to the Mainwaring for being beholden in and of itself. The idea that then you aren't locked into the ending of Edith Wharton. However, I think the Edith Wharton of it all becomes very important, especially in season 2, and I think that this season and the shape of this season and the Wharton of it all becomes very important in this particular moment that season 2 is coming out in, because Wharton was writing really deft social commentary about the elite during the Gilded Age. Because it's really easy to think about stories historically, especially in the age of Bridgerton, which again, we know I'm a Bridgerton fan, I'm a historical romance fan, but historical romance is born of the idea of the marriage plot, a la something like Jane Austen, right? Where we are guaranteed that happily ever after, which is comforting and I enjoy, and we deserve happily ever afters. However, happily ever afters are not always a given. And Wharton is exploring that explicitly in her novels and the danger of being a woman, particularly a high-class woman, in her explorations. And not all of her characters are good people. Mrs. St. George in particular, from book to show, is a much different, much more sympathetic character. However, Wharton is looking at the dangers and the realities of being a woman in this world, and this is part of the stakes of the marriage plot in its purest form as well. The idea of the happily ever after is so hard won because the stakes are so high. And sure, the stakes of love are high, always, but particularly within the construct of this world. And we see this really in season 1, particularly with Jinny, and that plot line obviously carries over into a large part of this season, thankfully with a little bit of a reprieve due to Jinny being run away or having run away, because that is a very stressful plot line, but it's also the plot line and the kind of central focus of the season in particular and this exploration of women's rights at this time. And all of this really does tie back to the book in some ways. Though, of course, we're also balancing it with the friend group and the romances and love affairs. However, I do think that this exploration and the stakes of marriage at this time are particularly important to explore in the modern moment because we are seeing a lot of these kind of trad wife cosplaying ideals creep back into the conversation, but without any sense of the history and the limiting factors of women's history and what we have fought so hard for to be able to go about our daily lives in a lot of ways. And we see this obviously particularly with Jinny, but we're seeing it with all of the young women in different kind of shades in this season in particular. And some of those changes are very purposeful, I believe, as well in relation to conversation with the text, particularly in relation to Conchita. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. But the stakes are here, if heightened. The idea of looking at the realities of a world where divorce isn't possible, whether that be for reasons of safety or reasons of personal happiness, which are valid for different reasons. And in relation to Jinny in particular, we have watched recently the president get on national television and undermine domestic violence while we are being faced in this show with the reality of that. And that plot line continues to be one of the hardest ones for me. I really do not know how the actor who plays James did it. I hope he had a really solid process to get in and out of character for that because it's rough. And so through this exploration as well, we're watching this idea of being grown up or growing up. And we see this thesis kind of given from the very first episode of the season when Mrs. St. George's sister says, Nana's a year older than I was when I had her. So we are watching these characters grow up. And this, I think, gets to a lot of the tonal shifts between season 1 and season 2. And this is also rooted in the text of the book. We have a lot from the book that wasn't in the show that was kind of expedited. We got rid of a lot of things like Conchita's brother, Teddy, but we never saw the Saratoga of it. And this idea again in the book of Saratoga versus Newport and the class dynamics of that. And we get references to it in the very first episode. We see Mrs. St. George introduced as of Saratoga, but we are kind of consolidating all of that girlish energy starting with Conchita's wedding and watching these young women who are largely immature, still girls in many ways, in most ways, in all ways. And that's the point, as they kind of work through this world with reckless abandon while knowing that the stakes of it are so high at the end. However, this makes season 1, outside of the weight, especially of James as a character and his relations with both Elizabeth, Lizzy, and Jinny, there's the weight there from that, but they're kind of balancing it again with this recklessness. And so we are watching the way that these choices play out and the realization and the gravitas that these choices that are made kind of impetuously in some instances carry weight for the rest of these young women's lives. And we're watching them grow up down to Nan growing out her bob. And with this, I feel like we have some more narrative direction as well, which I think helps with the dialogue and the stakes, and it makes it feel a little bit more grounded because there was a looseness to parts of season 1 that didn't always read for me, and some of the dialogue felt particularly stilted or awkward or wasn't really coming from anything because it's hard, I think, to kind of bottle that youthful energy. We talk a lot, or have talked a lot the last couple of years, about the magic of Barbie summer and whatnot, but that genuine joy and sense of girlhood is hard to capture the spirit of. And so I think that here we are now able to appreciate some of that better by understanding where it's leading. And this goes for a lot of the changes that we see or are starting to see between the book and the show. Again, we've seen major deviations already in season 1, but I'm interested in how the arcs are continuing to move, where there are still parallels with the book, and how everything is still in conversation with each other, while also enjoying the quirks of the show itself. And I think, again, we return to this idea of the girls at the center of things and the removal of Test Valley as part of this growing up, and leaning on her friends for support in lieu of Miss Test Valley, who again is that maternal figure, but also very much a governess and kind of frames Nan as a child, and is part, I think, of the reason of the major jump in the book in particular, and how we watch Nan in the book kind of feel disassociated from herself within the marriage. And so we are kind of mirroring that still in the show, but Nan is also realizing her political power through being able to help her sister, but also realizing the larger world of that through both her sister and her mother's circumstances and the power that she holds in relation to this. And this is framed much more actively in the show, I would argue, than in the book. In the book, it's her caring about her tenants, essentially. And again, Theo, or the Theo equivalent in the book, because he's much more frequently referred to as Ushant, he is not this kind of Byron by way of Matthew McFadden in Pride and Prejudice kind of modeled hero. And he's very distant, and he's obsessed with clocks in this kind of symbolism of an orderly and having an orderly world, which we see deviate very significantly here. And so the conflicts between Nan and Theo, I think, in the show are much more interesting. In the book, it makes sense. It's Born of the World. But here, again, we're playing in that realm of a little bit more soap opera-y while also kind of rooting it in that. And we have much more dynamic and complicated character motivations where no one is right or wrong. Again, I don't know that that's necessarily the case in the book either, but it's easier to make Theo a villain in the book. And with this continued centering of the friend group, we of course have the continuation of one of the major deviations from the book continuing from season 1, which is Conchita and Dickie's relationship, which in the book very quickly sours. And what is born of lust or love, or however you want to frame it, goes a much more stereotypical route where Conchita is stifled by her surroundings and Richard starts having affairs, Conchita starts having affairs, and their money is running out on top of everything. Here, we still have the money plotline, which I think is going to become very important as we continue, or if we continue into a season 3, and I am specifically keeping my eye on because that is one of the most significant factors in relation to the end of the book, and if we are going to see any kind of remaining echoes of the end of the Mainwaring interpretation of the book. But we are seeing a happy marriage in the show, and it's delightful, which is why I should have known not to trust it. Luckily, I was watching episode 6 on the treadmill because I knew that Jinny was coming back in that episode, and it allowed me to work out some of the anxiety and frustration and fear of that in particular. And then I was also able to contain some of my emotions at the end of that episode. And I was heartbroken, but I also really, really liked how they were playing with this because we saw Dickie and Conchita as a united front. We saw them kind of going up against society and trying to make it work and get money how they could while also kind of reveling in their love story. And so here we are watching a kind of interpretation of a failed love story from a different vein than we even got in the book. Because Conchita in the show has her love story, and society still ruins it. The patriarchy still ruins it. There's a quote in episode 6 that kind of got my hackles up, but also I think was a really expert kind of observation and subtle observation, especially for this show, to be completely honest, where Theo and Guy are talking. And by all accounts, these two men, despite like personal kind of interrelational stuff, have been really good allies throughout the show. Guy, who really gave up his life to help Jenny. Theo, who has really stood up with Nan even amidst the personal discord for political things, and also showing up for her and her friends where needed. And both of them are kind of reckoning with the patriarchy, essentially, and the laws and systems of power that protect James rather than Jenny in situations like this. And Theo essentially says, thank God for women, which is such an interesting comment because in this moment of recognizing the problem, it's putting the burden of fixing things back on women. And this kind of absolution or throwing your hands up and saying, well, this is how things are, rather than envisioning how things could be, which is what we're seeing Nan do over the course of the show. And the way that she is much more politically minded in the show, like I said, than in the book, and kind of framing that in a much different way and showing it very actively, being a lot more obvious with its illustrations than kind of the more subtle, again, more internally focused character study kind of revelations of the novel that speak to these larger systems and structures of power. We also have the benefit now of being able to commentate on these things with distance and with more freedoms that we are at risk of losing. And speaking of loss, with Dickie, we really illustrate the violence of the patriarchy, the violence of this particular form of patriarchy that many now want to see us return to, and how this also robs us of good men. And so at the end of the day, it's really putting Conchita narratively in a very similar position to what she's in the book, but she is now a much more sympathetic character in a lot of ways, and we are again introducing another shade of grief and another way that the world has for women to fail in it in whatever ways, while also again providing this additional shade of commentary of the world these young women are existing and moving in, while potentially positioning us for the same economic desperation as in the book, but with all of these added layers. Speaking of extra layers, I do want to touch on Jenny's storyline here before we move on from the more overt patriarchy of it all. I really don't want to dwell in the domestic violence of it because we know it's there. It's very visceral. It's very real. The fear of that is very visceral and real, as it was in season 1. And it's a very hard storyline for me personally, to be completely honest. But here, especially when Jinny and Guy are in Italy, we are seeing Jenny find herself in a lot of ways and realize her worth, but also gaining skills as a young woman of high society that she wouldn't necessarily have had, such as cooking. And it's interesting again in conversation with the modern moment, as we mentioned, because Jenny's dream was to be a proper society wife. She wanted that marriage to work, and it didn't through no fault of her own. And so we are watching her world crumble despite her wanting to be the perfect upstanding wife. And yet in this season, we get to watch her reclaim bits of herself while also really reckoning with the insidiousness of domestic violence and the nuances for victims, especially once James shows up in Italy and has made contact with Jinny again and the vulnerability there. But I enjoyed getting to see her outside of that context, and especially toward the end, once we got past episode 6 in particular, and then also getting to watch her relationship with, in particular, Conchita reframe and folding her back into the larger circle of the girls and seeing that complete group again, I thought was really wonderful. But her plot line is not easy and remains probably my least favorite of the show, simply because the subject matter is so tough. And with that, let's at least briefly touch on all of the love triangles of this show with all of their myriad configurations that, again, really harken back to the Gossip Girl of it all, but also really illustrate the stakes. As much as it kind of keeps going and you're like, this too, this piece of the triangle too, it's also this understanding that every choice has this seemingly kind of oversized reaction or result because the choices have so much more weight. And there is a lot of parallelism, I would argue, in this as well as throughout the whole season, particularly in relation to Nan, both with her mother, especially in relation to her ending of the season, and also between her and Theo. And I thought that this was particularly interesting because we have the love triangle between Nan, Theo, and Guy as we know it at the start of the season, and then we add Lizzy into the mix. And I have some really complicated feelings about this because I want Lizzy to have her happily ever after, especially after season 1, and I struggled when I saw it kind of forming. And at first, especially at the start of the season, I was really excited because in the book, Lizzy marries Hector, and he is a politician. She does end up a politician's wife, but by all accounts, she has a reasonably happy marriage. Maybe not as happy and as off in the distance as Mabel, who marries some man from presumably Chicago. They say Illinois, but presumably Chicago in the book, and we will come back to her, do not worry. But there was a contentedness there. And so to see her pulled into another love triangle was kind of rough. But narratively, I think it's really interesting because I kept wondering where Theo and Nan's marriage was going to go, especially knowing in the book that they are very distant from each other, and Nan has really lost herself in this marriage. She becomes Annabelle in this marriage, and what the weight of that title does to her. And he is very distant from it all, and the title and the heir remain the sole focus. And I think that the way that that was played with within the show really worked for me as well as we moved in and out of the kind of focus of that. Aside from the twist at the end of the season, which maybe I'll remember to come back to, but I thought was kind of absurd, and we'll see where it goes. But with Nan and Theo, I kept wondering where that break was going to happen because we had these moments of Nan trying to make it work. And I thought that here is where the season really started to work for me and the storytelling really started to work for me because we had this added gravitas and it kind of removed some of this puppy love and also reframed it to where by the end of the season, when Nan and Guy were kind of recreating the staircase moment, it did make me feel something where before, I'm not gonna lie to you, I was kind of annoyed with both of them. And so we're watching them grow up and have to deal with the weight of their choices and the weight of the world and the choices the world is forcing them to make. And we keep having all of these internal reversals as well. And so we see Nan trying to make it work with Theo, the revelation of the betrayal before the wedding and the emotional response to that, Theo kicking his mother out of the house, and the parallelism between the mothers of this season as well. We could argue that James and Dickie's mother does not suffer enough by the end of the season with the loss of both of her sons, essentially. But in many ways, she has served her greatest comeuppance in that too. She has to sit in that misery and knowing that she caused it to some degree. And so we're looking at kind of the way that these titles and the way that the systems of power kind of mold the future for these people and how our characters are beholden to the power already in motion and are being forced to play within that game. And we see this with Theo's mother and the introduction of Hector's father and the romance there and the idea that she left him behind for the title when they were younger and the reality of that and giving up your entire life for the title, what we see her give up for the title, those moments of sympathy and kind of camaraderie with Nan and seeing some of herself in Nan and seeing the potential for Nan to become her. I really, really liked what we did with the Dowager Duchess this season because I think that those parallels were really compelling and I like kind of analyzing and being in conversation with the different generations and what our choices could lead to, especially as, again, we have these leads who are very young, presenting very young. Their choices read very young, though we're again watching them grow up. And I think the kind of shift in costumes over the course of the season. And again, they're very anachronistic down to the red lip that Nan wears when she's trying to change the conversation from her sister. And I think that a lot of this season can be summed up by the idea of trying to change the conversation, trying to change the system, trying to change the world that these characters are beholden to. And we're seeing this play out in these love triangles. So back to these love triangles a little bit because I think that they're where the character explorations particularly for these characters, are most interesting. So we again are seeing Nan going back to this kind of idea of changing the conversation. We're seeing her step into the power of this title and recognize her power for a young woman. And an appeal, or Theo's initial appeal, was this idea that she had no interest in the title. And so the betrayal of her naming the power the title holds later in the season lands extra for that. But again, we're seeing that betrayal in relation to a man who has never lived without power. And I think that if Theo, and as Theo potentially, is going to face a world without power, that may shape things very differently. And that may be very interesting because it's easy to think about giving up power when you have it. But we are watching these young women try to claim power in whatever way they can. And for Nan, we are watching this politically as her personal life also bleeds into the political, because the personal is political, and using what strings she can to protect her sister, but also then protect more people through the passing of Hector's bill. The idea of Hector as well, I feel like I'm going off. I had, point by couples, but Hector is particularly interesting too, because if we're looking at as a character, again, much different than the book, and the idea that he is backing this good work in the public eye, but is capable of personal trickery and deception and evil deeds to some extent. And I think that that is very true to form in a lot of ways. And so, anyway, we're watching Nan kind of balance this with her love of Guy. And I think that while I found Guy much more attractive in this season, I think that, again, Nan and Guy are born of this kind of love at first sight that I never felt truly deep. And I think that's part of it, right? With season one, kind of talking about the recklessness of it and this wildness of youth, but also there is this lingering connection between these two. And so it rings a little truer here when we're watching them kind of maneuver around the real stakes of their lives as well, and the life that Guy is finding, particularly with Freddie, Jenny's son, and the connection there. I'm really interested to see how that's going to play out, and the kind of family they form in Italy, with additionally the introduction of their friend Paloma, who I thought was an excellent addition to the show, a new character completely. And again, another kind of parallel we see play out, especially in relation to Nan and the potential hypocrisies of Nan. And I really enjoyed understanding her as a character and understanding the emotional conflict, while also thinking at times that she was being hypocritical, though a lot of the moves she was making in the last episode that seemed a little out of character were suitably explained. However, I also appreciated the complications of these parallels where nothing was cut and dry. And so we were also forcing Nan to face that, and forcing her to decenter herself in a lot of ways and face where she was centering herself where she might not have thought she was. And I thought she overall handled it with a lot of grace. Of course, there were missteps and there were fights between friends, but I really enjoyed the way that this friend group maneuvered through a lot of this, down to Theo and Lizzy, which was a really interesting relationship to me. Again, I thought it was interesting from a parallelism and a complication standpoint, because the minute that's introduced, Theo no longer has the moral high ground with Nan. And so I was very interested in where their relationship and marriage was going to go in relation to how it was going to be in conversation with the book. Were we going to see a pretty significant plot point, especially from the book, that we have potentially still set up with the revelation of Nan's pregnancy at the end of the season? And it's not a good plot point. So we will see. Again, they've deviated pretty significantly already. So there is no trust necessarily that that's going to happen. But the minute we introduce Lizzy and Theo and Lizzy's attraction, we complicate the moral high ground that any of these characters have. So no character has a moral high ground. So they're all working off of their attractions, and they're being led by these attractions in a lot of ways. And with Theo and Lizzy, a lot of that attraction is physical. And the chemistry between these two actors was really good, which works because there are declarations of love. However, they haven't really spent time together. Is it love just born of this crucible, of this emotional devastation on Theo's part and on Lizzy's part in some ways as well? This idea that Hector represents safety and security for her, but he doesn't have her whole heart, and there's something exciting and exhilarating, those are synonyms, in Theo and what that represents. And I did like that speech from Theo when he ran to the wedding, very Gregory in Bridgerton style. And again, Lizzy is conflicted because she pursued this or allowed this to happen because she thought Nan had left to Italy forever, that she had denounced Theo. At the same time, she's still technically married to him, so it becomes complicated. But I'm also interested to see the longevity of that relationship. At the same time that I really want a happily ever after for Lizzy, again, especially after everything she's been through, and I have kind of stream of consciousness notes from as I was watching the season, kind of to that effect, going from the excitement of Hector showing up because I assumed that we were going to follow the book in that way, to the kind of wait, what? As I realized where we were going with Theo and Lizzy. But again, if we continue with the season 3, what is that relationship going to look like without a title for Theo? Because for Lizzy, there's the need for security and safety and income. What does her life look like without that? And what does Theo know of living a life without any of those things? What are his skills? Is he going to go be a clockmaker like he dreams of being in the book? Maybe. But I'm very interested to see that, especially as, again, a lot of their connection initially was very physical and born of this kind of emotional uncertainty from both of them. And that presents a lot of emotional depth at first, but will that last? At the same time, I can't root for her with Hector anymore after the revelations of the last episode. Or can I? Because the show has been really good at kind of complicating a lot of these moves. Again, very Gossip Girl in that no one is perfect, no one has a moral high ground, and there is a lot of mess. At the same time, as we're talking about parallelism, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the penultimate episode is focused on the St. George divorce and the complications of that, the risks to Mrs. St. George's reputation that derive from that, but also we see this balanced or paralleled with Nan and Hector, to whatever degrees, fights for women's rights in England. And so we planted the seed of divorce being an option. We now know the stakes of divorce. We know the difficulties of divorce. And did I want to punch that lawyer in the face? Many a time, but also those snide little comments ring true even today. And so have we set up the possibility of divorce down the line in this series? Because as much as we talk about Wharton exploring the other side of the marriage plot and the difficulties and limitations and dangers of marriage, especially for women, or even not having a marriage for women at this time, particularly within this social set, at the same time, this book, if again, it's hard to know how we're considering the end of it in relation to this show, since we are not using the completion of it. Are we still considering any of Wharton's notes in the direction? I don't know. But by Wharton's standards, the Buccaneers has what I would argue, and again, I do still need to read The Custom of the Country, but I would argue that this is the happiest ending I can personally recollect in my reading life of Edith Wharton. Is it a happy ending? No, not necessarily. But it's also an open-ended ending that allows for the possibility of that happiness. And so I'm very interested in where we're going with all of it, what the idea of the ending is here, and especially in consideration of the modern conversation of it all. What do modern audiences expect from an ending from a show like this? Would we accept something that isn't a happy ending? I mean, if we got it, that's what we'd have, and that would be it. But also, if we are so in conversation with the modern moment, especially in relation to women's rights in the modern moment with this series, what would not having a happy ending be saying as well? Though, speaking of happy endings, let's talk just briefly about my favorite couple in the show, and potentially my favorite character in the show, Honoria and Mabel, who we don't get as much screen time as I was honestly expecting, especially considering they are sharing a room for at least part of the season. But we are watching Mabel allow Honoria room to grow and to fly and to find herself in a way that was just really lovely and sentimental and sweet. And even as Honoria was going off to France, I was thinking of Villette by Charlotte Bronte and wondering if that was her fate. And I hope she comes back in the new season and that they reconnect, because I'm interested too. There, we're obviously exploring Mabel's fate and we're looking at her queer identity in relation to the show, but the idea of a young woman who isn't going to marry, in theory. If she does marry, for what reason? And this is obviously deviating very much from the text because Mabel gets the least attention paid to her in the original Wharton, and she gets married to an American and goes off, and we don't really hear from her outside of passing references again. And so we have this opportunity that is being taken for showing a different aspect of society and a different fate that young women would have been facing down. With Mabel, we have more of a kind of party girl-esque type. But as I am drawn to Wallflowers, canonically, of course, am drawn to Honoria and her getting to kind of spread her wings more this season, which is, of course, the whole point of it. They make that very clear. But her escaping her family in a lot of ways, and the way that she has been beholden to that family, finding family with the girls. Also, I just really want her tailored because her shirt waists were always so impeccably tailored, and I need that because my button-ups never look like that. Anyway, I thought that that relationship was just really sweet. I liked it even more than season one somehow, I think, and it continues to be part of my favorite bits of the season. And I also think that it added a lightness that was needed, especially getting to see these queer women choose and grasp their happiness wherever they could or how they could, and letting that be enough. I really enjoyed that. So hopefully we get to continue in that vein. I want a historical romance in that vein like yesterday. I would argue Emma R. Albin's Don't Want You Like a Best Friend might be close, but I want something a little angstier for those two, potentially, at least at the start. I don't know. If you have a good historical romance a la Mabel and Honoria recommendation, give it to me because I very much need it right now. But I think that they are a well-needed balance to the season, and there was something really joyous about getting to see them come out to their friends as well and to see them celebrated by their friends, which again returns us to the kind of beauty of the explorations of female friendship here and the way that we have these opportunities for these women to pit or be pit against each other in the way that society will pit women against each other, especially at this time. And we see it very explicitly in the Wharton novel, especially from Mrs. St. George's perspective and thinking about her daughters in relation to Mabel and Elizabeth, Lizzy. We see it in season one when Jinny kind of strikes out at Lizzy. And so we're getting to see the kind of continuation of that, this idea of these strong friendships born of girlhood and the celebration of that are complicated and tested by entering the wider world. And we're seeing them kind of refined and solidified here, even as they are complicated and tested. And even as we don't end the season purely intact, especially in relation to Nan and Lizzy. And again, I think the stylistic choices of this series are interested in paralleling it to today in a lot of ways, being in active conversation. I know we've talked before about the Bridgertonification of a lot of classics and this kind of anachronistic style that use these modern touches, which is also not new to Bridgerton. Just going off the top of my head, things like the Marie Antoinette movie, which I'm also always a sucker for Griff in the soundtrack, see My Lady Jane, and with references to A Midsummer Night's Dream, including that visual reference to an Ever After shot, and ending with A Masquerade. this is also, perfectly priming me for Bridgerton season 4. And listen, these are very broad, overarching thoughts. Maybe we'll come back and pick at some of them in more detail or revisit something down the line. But for now, that is what season 2 of this show is kind of leaving me with. Again, I'm going to be completely honest. I went into this season not expecting to have a good time. And while I don't necessarily think it was perfect, it could still be heavy handed at times. The dialogue, while much, much cleaner, still had its moments. But at the same time, I saw the vision, I think, a lot clearer with this season, especially being able to look at it in relation to season 1. And while it deviated very significantly textually from the book, I think that it had an interesting vision and something interesting to say, and it wasn't pretending like it was a beat for beat retelling of the book either. It is interesting to look at in consideration, especially as we are really in the depths of discussion, though it has kind of waned a little bit, of the newest Wuthering Heights trailer, which doesn't feel textually accurate to the book, though there are, of course, different factors at play. And while some of the deviations play a little broad to me, some of the plotting is a little soap opera-y, I do think leaning into it makes it work a lot better. And there are a lot of time jumps in the book as well that are hard to translate to a beat to beat adaptation. So if you've watched this show, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on season 2 in relation to season 1, in conversation with season 1, what you thought worked in the show, what you did not think worked super well, or what you would like to see. But overall, I'm just interested in this vision and to see where it goes. And luckily, it wasn't a waste of an Apple Plus trial week. And yeah, so thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,